Welcome to lecture number 28, Music Theory Questions from You. So let's start with the very first one that I got, and I'm going through all the ones that were emailed to me. The first question was, how do you find the parallel major to minor and vice versa? And the key signature tells everything, it tells all. So if you look at the first example, parallel simply means they start on the same note. So if I have C major, its parallel starts on the C, but is the natural minor. That's true for all keys. So remember this, parallel means it simply starts on the same pitch. Relative means they have the same genetics. They're related to each other. They have the same key signature. So if I start with E flat major, and then I go to the sixth note of that, and drop it down an octave, then I automatically get its relative minor. So don't get those confused. It's easy to kind of get them confused, but if you think of relative as having the same genetic material and parallel as having the same starting note, you'll be just fine. Rhythmic devices. I was asked to define rhythmic augmentation, cross rhythms, and polyrhythms. Now, a polyrhythm is nothing more than competing subdivisions of the beat. In other words, if the subdivision of the beat is 2, but at the same time I'm playing sets of 3s, that's called a polyrhythm. Now, there are several kinds, but the most common polyrhythm is the one that's in the very top, and I'll play that for you. So you'll notice that it sounds a little disjointed. Now, if it's a cross rhythm, it's that, but it makes up an entire piece. Now, this is true in West African drumming and in jazz quite frequently, and in a lot of classical pieces where tremendous experimentation was done, mostly in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. So they're very related to each other. A cross rhythm is a polyrhythm, but it defines a whole piece. A hemiola is a specific kind of polyrhythm. It just means 3 against 2. And I just played 2 examples of 3 against 2. The 3 was in the upper voice, and the 2 was in the lower voice. It gives you this kind of composite rhythm sound where one is going in 2 and the other is going in 3. Rhythmic augmentation is quite simple. It simply means that you take this compositional device where you have a melody and you make it longer in note values. So listen to this really simple 2-part counterpoint. Now slower. That's rhythmic augmentation, making the note values longer. On Mozart's variations of like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, he does that. Composers do it all the time. And sometimes they'll take the melody, augment it, and then have fast counterpoint going against it. It's really quite a clever device, but it's very, very common. So rhythmic augmentation, just make the note values longer. Rhythmic diminution, make them shorter. So if I did that same thing and put the second version in 16th notes, you'd catch the notion of diminution. In other words, smaller or larger. Different kinds of periods. There's parallel, contrasting, sequential, modulating, and the double period. There's a handout that I put on Canvas so you can look at this in detail. But parallel simply means both phrases begin with similar or identical material. So you have a phrase, it has a lot of material, and the second one is very, very similar. So a period is made up of at least 2 full phrases, usually with a cadence at the end. Cadence is sometimes 5, sometimes it's 1, sometimes, like in minor, it's the 3 chord, and then it moves on into another section. Contrasting period just means the phrase begins with different, unrelated material. Sequential means the material of the beginning of the two phrases is sequentially related. So for instance, if one goes ba-dee-dee-da-dee-dee-da-da-da-dum, the second phrase goes ba-dee-dee-ba-dee-dee-da-dee-dee-dee. Then you could say that that period is sequential. Modulating, that's pretty obvious, I think. The consequent phrase begins or accomplishes a modulation. So you have the initial phrase, and then the consequent phrase, the one that comes second, modulates. So maybe the first one's in C major, but the whole second phrase is in G, in 5. It's tonicized that whole area 5. That's a modulating phrase. And the double period typically consists of 4 phrases. You have the first 2 phrases and the last 2 phrases. They're paired together. And so the cadence of the second pair is stronger than the cadence of the first pair. And there are a couple of different types of double periods. The parallel, that's the material that begins each half is very similar. Then contrasting, the material that begins each half is different. We see this in sonata form a lot. The handout will really help you. But that's only the 5 kinds that you really need to know. And they're really logical when you think about parallel, contrasting, sequential, and modulating, and then a double. What is imitation in music theory? This is a good question. It's the repetition of a melody or motive, usually in a polyphonic texture, shortly after its first appearance in a different voice. This happens in fugues, it happens in inventions, and it happens in all kinds of music. A round is an imitation. So the melody may vary through transposition, inversion, or otherwise, but it retains its original character, which is usually the interval set or the contour. So here's an example by Bartók. Listen to the imitation. And this particular piece continues that way for quite a while. It's a very interesting device. So if one of the questions was imitation used, look for a restatement of that opening material. Or maybe it's in the middle of the piece, you hear it, and then it's restated in several forms. The next is the Phrygian cadence, and it means 4/6, minor 4/6, that's the important distinction, to 5 or 5/7 in minor. Now you could always do it in major as well if the 4 chord is borrowed from the parallel minor. So if I have C major, I'm in C major, but I borrow F minor, put it in first inversion, and then go to the 5/7 chord, and I can go back to major. So composers did that a lot. So here's the Phrygian half cadence. Now the important thing is you look at that part and it says Phrygian. That tells you 4/6 to 5. Half cadence tells you 5. So this phrase ends on the 5 chord. And it's preceded by the 4/6, the minor 4/6. So listen to this. Now, the nice thing about that is that that particular cadence gives you a half-step motion in the bass. And it's just delightful. It really is quite satisfying. A way to get to 5/7 is to use minor 4/6. Now, here's another example, and that would be the Phrygian cadence, but it's going to be tonicizing the 6 chord. So this was very similar to one of the questions we had on that AP theory practice test. So the Phrygian cadence still is, in this case, a half cadence, because notice the pause. It's on an E-flat dominant chord. Why that? Because it is the 5/7 of 6. So listen how cool this is. Still, the minor 4/6 is used, which is D-flat in the key of A-flat, which is the 6th chord. So listen how it works. So that's really common as a way to modulate, is to use the Phrygian cadence. So all you have to remember when you see the word Phrygian, minor 4 to 5, always. And the reason for Phrygian, it has nothing to do with Phrygian mode. It has to do with the half-step kind of voicing. Because in the Phrygian scale, the first two notes are a half-step. That's where the term comes from. It can be a little confusing. So don't confuse that with the mode itself. It's just a voice leading term. What's the difference between a suspension and a retardation? A suspension keeps a note the same and then resolves by downward motion. So this example sounds like this. Do you hear how the C is held across and then resolves downward? Well, here's another one. This is the 7/6. So this 7/6 suspension in the middle of a phrase. So those suspensions that I have for you on this particular example are the most common and virtually the only ones that we think about with respect to diatonic chords. The 4/3, the 7/6, the 9/8, and the 2/3. And the numbers, once again, indicate the note above the root that's of the chord that's being resolved. So the 9/8, there's the first chord, and it resolves like this. And what's really kind of cool about it is it creates a moment of downbeat dissonance on the second chord, and then it's resolved. Retardation is the same idea, only the note goes up. So we get this sound. There's my one chord, and that resolves going up. That doesn't sound as conclusive. It sounds like it wants to keep moving, like it's almost a passing tone. And the next example, the 7/8. It almost sounds like it wants to go here. So the retardation moves up, the suspension moves down, but each note is held across the bar line and then resolved. What's the difference between overlapping voices and crossed voices? They're very, very similar, except there is just a slight contextual difference. So cross voicing is the intersection of melodic lines in a composition, leaving a lower voice on a higher pitch than the higher voice. So this happens a lot in chants. We even see it in Bach. So listen to this Kyrie. I'll just play a little bit of it. So now the tenor comes up to the C while the alto stays on the A. So there they've crossed, and then they come to a unison. That's voice crossing. So it's when one goes over the other in the melodic context. That's usually what we're talking about. Now, overlapping is just a different kind. It's when they're moving in the same direction. So for instance, in this case, but the lower note moves higher than the higher note, like alto in this case, goes higher than the soprano was. That's voice overlap. It's still a kind of cross voicing, but that distinction probably will be on the AP Theory exam. Voice crossing, just think of two cars crossing on a freeway. Overlapping, this one is just overlapping the top. It's jumping over the top. That's the simplest way I remember those. Pedal point or pedal is merely a note that's held for a long time, while other chords change above it. It's almost always the tonic or the dominant in a piece, which is held through a series of chord changes, and it sets up usually a lot of tension into a big relief point. So if I were using this particular example in a composition, I'd play right through it. See how dense and tense that is? And then I would go probably some kind of resolution or deceptive cadence even. To analyze this, you simply would say pedal, put like a bracket underneath it and say pedal, and then you would put the chords above the pedal. So you'd label it in two places. Once you just say G pedal on the bottom, and then you put G on the top, G7 on the top, C, C sharp diminished, D7, and so on above the top. And you could use the Roman numerals in the given key that you have. Another question was, what is the secondary dominant option? That was kind of a confusing question on the test. All that simply means is you have an option to tonicize the 5 chord or any other chord. So you can tonicize any chord. In this case, you'll notice that what I have is a progression that goes 2, 7, 5, 1. So I've got this, and it goes right to the 5, and then to the 1. Nothing wrong with that. But you have an option here of tonicizing the 5 chord. So if you do that, then you have the leading tone of the 5 chord. So listen to both of them, one right after the other. Nice cadence. Another nice cadence with just a different quality to it. It adds kind of a lift and it makes it a little more interesting. That's all the secondary dominant option refers to. It means when you have a 5 chord, you can put its 5 in front of it. Or if you have any chord you want to tonicize, put its 5 in front of it as if that chord was in a new key, in the key of its root. Okay, how do modes work? Well, modes are all diatonic scales built from each note of a major scale. Now, we've gone over this, but it's been a while ago. And they can also be built from minor or altered scales, but when we usually refer to modes, we refer to the ones you see. And they're sometimes called the church modes only because a lot of hymns had melodies, especially at the time of Bach and just prior to Bach, in the late Renaissance, that were modal. And these come originally from were named for Greek city-states. And the Greeks had all kinds of modes and thought a different mode had a different emotion that went with it. So for instance, Ionian mode, which is major, sounds like that. Dorian mode, you could write a whole melody and cadence on the Dorian. Now to our ears, it doesn't sound complete, but depending on the culture one is in, those modes could do that. That's all it refers to. The most important 2 modes are Ionian, which is major, and Aeolian, which is natural minor. So when we say that the natural minor is on the 6th mode of major, we're simply saying, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's built off the 6th scale degree. Now, I use a mnemonic to remember this. I don't paint like Michelangelo. Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. Just to remember the order of those. So you might be asked, well, what mode is this in? Just figure out what scale it is. Look at the key signature and then figure out what scale tone that is. If it's the 1st scale tone, it's Ionian. If it's the 5th, it's Mixolydian, and so on. Hearing and identifying triad qualities, this is just something you have to practice. But just remember that augmented always refers to the 5th. You have a major 3rd with an augmented 5th. Kind of a mysterious sound. Major has a major 3rd and a perfect 5th. Minor, minor 3rd and a perfect 5th. And diminished has a minor 3rd and a diminished 5th. And to really identify these, you have to look at the spellings. That's why when you're looking at any chorale and you look at the figured bass or you're trying to figure out the figured bass, spell the triad above. Scratch it out above the triad as you see it on the staff and look at the notes. If it's C, E, G sharp, well, that's a C, E, G triad, but the fifth is sharp. So what is it? Augmented, and so on. That just takes lots of practice. So what I'm going to ask you to do is simple. Keep asking questions. And I can put these little lectures together for you. We're going to have a lot of sound files we're going to be working with. But the important thing is keep asking. So I'll see you in class. Thank you.